Hello everyone and welcome to Emily vs. Art Special Edition, The Apocalypse. This will be a series covering a few different topics under the tattered umbrella of Apocalyptica. First up, I thought it would be good to cover our bases with some historical context. Of course, the question on all your minds is, why would an art channel be covering something like this? Well, we all have our influences, and the apocalypse, pre, during, and post, is fascinating to me. I've consumed media of all types, from movies to books to graphic novels, in search of the perfect apocalyptic story. Of course, I've never found it, if there is such a thing, and often that frustration becomes a source of inspiration for myself and many other artists. Whatever the theme, from science fiction to fantasy, many creators are responding to what they perceive is a missing element from the current zeitgeist. If we are to build upon our source material, we should at least try to understand it. And so today we are going to be exploring just a bit of the history and the motivations behind our obsession with the end of the world. To get some vocabulary out of the way, eschatology is the study of the end of things. There are plenty of different eschatologies, many but not all religious. Today we'll be talking about three of them: the Norse, Christian, and, well, the Mayans are a special case, and we'll get to them. To begin, I thought we'd start with something that has recently been weirdly co-opted by Marvel in Thor Ragnarok, and of course, any movie that includes Thor and Loki. I love the movies, but they certainly take some liberties with the mythology. Ragnarok was an idea that was probably around for ages, but it wasn't until the 13th century that the two main epics referencing the event were compiled, the Poetic and the Prose Eddas. Here, a world-ending event is mentioned a few times, called Ragnarok or Ragnarokr, which mean Fate of the Gods and Twilight of the Gods, respectively. First, the world will experience Fimbulwinter, basically a Song of Ice and Fire style winter that lasts for 3 years, and before that environmental disaster, 3 years of huge battles will lead to a time of greed and betrayal among mankind. Brothers will kill brothers, and fathers and sons will suffer from the collapse of kinship bonds, as Wikipedia has so nicely provided for us. Then, Skoll the wolf, son of Fenrir, also a wolf, wakes up and swallows the sun, while his brother Hati, also a wolf, swallows the moon. The stars disappear, the earth shakes, and mountains fall, which in the end releases Fenrir from his bonds that had restrained him for basically the entirety of human history, I'm assuming. Now that I've introduced one of the subjects of my triptych, I can explain the composition a little more. I've chosen to paint a slightly altered study of a 1909 painting called Odin and Fenris by Dorothy Hardy, a British artist from the 19th and 20th century. During the Great Battle of the Gods and Monsters, Odin fights Fenrir and in fact loses to him. In my mind, the original painting, admittedly much more lifelike and impactful than mine, shows Odin at a turning point in the battle as Fenrir gains the upper hand? Paw? Despite the horrific period of Fimbulwinter and the Battle of the Gods, which is, of course, accompanied by a time of horrible natural disasters, including a flood of the entire world, which is, of course, a classic religious theme, the world eventually does resurface anew. It is reborn fertile and ready for repopulation by two humans. Another very common theme. The surviving gods meet and all is well, if a bit shaken up. Unlike the Christian beliefs surrounding a literal apocalypse, which I'll cover further on, the Norse mythologies seem to be focused on the cyclical nature of the universe. Rather than actually being the end of the world, where heaven and hell are all that's left, humanity is allowed to continue living and growing on Yggdrasil, the world tree, though of course most likely taken down a few pegs. Around the same time period as the compilation of the Poetic and Prose Eddas, the Mayans were experiencing a post-classical period of demographic shifts. I'm not a scholar, and my research was very bare bones, thank you Wikipedia, but I can imagine that these were people hearkening for a return to the great times of old. The reason I bring this up is because the source of all of the 2012 apocalypse trouble was a simple Mayan calendar that marked the end of a time period. Past scholars translated the written works of the Mayans, and the troublesome long count calendar was interpreted very loosely. A compilation of these creation and possibly apocalyptic myths of the Coxie Maya, called the Popol Vuh, describes 3 failed worlds created by gods before a successful 4th world was populated by humanity. In the long count calendar, the 4th world would reach its end on the 13th Baktun, whatever that actually means, and in 1966, Michael D. Coe wrote, "There is a suggestion that Armageddon would overtake the degenerate peoples of the world and all creation on the final day of the 13th Baktun. Thus, our present universe would be annihilated when the great cycle of the long count reaches completion." This interpretation was repeated by other scholars, especially in the early 90s, but later, other researchers would basically say no, you're wrong. To give a few examples, Sandra Noble, executive director of the Foundation for the Advancement of Mesoamerican Studies, said, "For the ancient Maya, it was a huge celebration to make it to the end of a whole cycle, and the 2012 phenomenon is a complete fabrication and a chance for a lot of people to cash in," which I actually agree with. Commenting on the new calendar found at Zoltan, which ended up giving people a little bit more context on this whole 13th Baktun thing, an archaeologist said that the ancient Maya predicted the world would continue. That 7,000 years from now, things would be exactly like this. We are the ones who keep looking for endings. The Maya were looking for a guarantee that nothing would change. It's an entirely different mindset. And that brings me back to my point about the post-classical period of the Coxie Maya. They, like our own society today in many ways, probably saw the past as a time of great success and glory. Just as we use different political and religious ideologies to justify a return to the good old days, the Maya seemed to want their calendar to represent the everlasting nature of their civilization. In the end, there is no apocalypse. But I still felt that this was an excellent story to share, because despite all of my talk about how past mythologies inform our current media consumption, this particular phenomena was an entirely modern fabrication. That's why artists and creators need to know where their influences are coming from, because the movie 2012 made absolutely no sense, and I hate it, and it shouldn't have happened, but it did. Next up is the apocalypse that has been reshaped, repackaged, and resold for over 2,000 years, the Judeo-Christian Book of Revelations. Just for brevity's sake, of course, we'll be focusing on the Christian part of Judeo-Christian, as most of the eschatology does come from the New Testament. Also, I want to clarify that by comparing the fake Maya mythos of the apocalypse to the Book of Revelations, I am simply establishing that while the historical Maya did not believe in an apocalypse in 2012, historical Christians often did believe in a second coming of Christ with great enthusiasm. The social and cultural impact of this belief has been around for a very long time and has infected our media for just as long. I mean, the Raphael Coxie painting that I'm doing a study of here is from 1588, and there were plenty of older ones too. To get into the background a little bit, the final book of the New Testament is the Book of Revelation. The word apocalypse comes from the first word of the text in Greek, apokalypsis, which means unveiling or revelation. Nowadays, of course, it means end of the world, but that's probably a direct result of this connection to the Christian mythology. I'm actually not even going to go into the details of the apocalypse here. We all know the basics. The Raphael Coxie painting is called The Last Judgment, when bad and good people get sorted. We've all heard of the Rapture, where those good people go to heaven, and we know the Antichrist is bad. There are seals and demons and signs and the 4 horsemen and all the other things that the show creators of Supernatural used over and over again. But I want to focus on the ideology behind all of the symbolic or prophetic fluff. Some researchers say that Revelations is just a review of history, or refers to the fall of the Roman Empire that was occurring during the time of the supposed author, or authors. Others think that it is completely prophetic and literal, and John was just writing about events in language that was familiar to him, and it's up to us to apply it to our modern day existence. The wooiest of readings are those that say, no, calm down. It's just a metaphor about the ongoing struggle between good and evil. All of these interpretations have been used in historical and modern media of all types. The apocalypse as the fall of a nation-state was particularly common during the nuclear apocalypse heyday of the mid-20th century, while more strict, literal interpretations are actually pretty rare these days. The Four Horsemen and the traditional Antichrist are solidly in the domains of religious fundamentalists, while our modern TV, film, and literature are favoring a more metaphorical take. I mean, look at Bird Box. It has none of the actual details of any of the apocalypse that I mentioned today, and yet it too captures the essence of the end of the world as we know it, and then even throws in some weird stuff about the human condition just for the fun of it. By the way, the book is great, and I highly recommend it. So why do we, as consumers, give a crap about any of it? Why do we like Mad Max, The Road, and The Walking Dead, despite their vastly different aesthetic and narrative designs? Why do we keep pulling from the same literal and metaphorical interpretations of human mythology? First of all, there are a few psychological concepts behind why human beings have found the end of the world fascinating for pretty much our entire written history and probably before. I'm not going to do any of these concepts justice, but here's a quick review. Some studies show that an anticipated negative event is perceived less negatively than an unanticipated one. If you are subjected to a scheduled, predetermined electric shock, you perceive it to be less painful than a sudden, unanticipated stimulus. Human beings seek out patterns, even negative ones. And beyond that desire to predict and control chaos, to make a pattern out of the patternless, on the opposite end of the spectrum, a more cosmic apocalypse removes individual responsibility. If you're not in control at all, this can also lead to a sort of liberation fantasy from the routine. With no society, no responsibility, you are free to do as you please in the wasteland. I know that sounds a bit anarchical, so on a more positive note, research has shown that acknowledging, or to an even more extreme extent, preparing for the apocalypse is goal-oriented behavior, which allows individuals to, again, feel more control over their fate. This is where conspiracy theorists and apocalyptic preppers tend to overlap, as they share many of the same core beliefs. The persistent impotence or feeling of powerlessness that many preppers and conspiracy theorists experience in modern-day society leads to the aforementioned goal-oriented behavior and a desire for a lack of individual responsibility. This is just my interpretation, but I think that if you feel helpless but responsible, you are pretty much guaranteed to be miserable. But if you're not responsible, you can kind of say, screw it, let me get mine. And that's definitely a familiar frame of mind for many people these days. For more casual consumers of apocalyptic media, that liberation fantasy I mentioned earlier usually manifests in surviving and thriving, creating communities, and going back to nature in some way. Our modern lack of community, which is something that we often consider much more prevalent in past eras, regardless of whether that was a reality or not, this drives us to imagine situations where we are life and death relying on others, where social skills and negotiation are critical. On the other hand, in more action-oriented media, the fantasy becomes the Lone Ranger, especially in the West, where a sort of diluted individualism has people saying, if only I didn't have this pesky civilization holding me back, I'd be a real hero. Or a real villain. As someone who adores apocalyptic fiction, it feels important to educate myself and others. While new and original ideas are always a plus, most fiction and art has a historical and cultural background that informs our narrative and aesthetic decisions. And on the other hand, we should know when something is complete baloney and is actually a poor man's translation of a simple calendar. Thank you all for watching. I hope this was informative and that you guys enjoyed watching my art process. In the end, have a great one.